I'd like to welcome you to our International Expeditions webinar this evening, Cuba Beyond Havana. And here to kick off our presentation is Emily Harley. Emily, over to you.
Well, thank you, Lee, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I'm so excited to talk to you about Cuba, someplace I've been lucky enough to visit several times over the past few years, and just an incredible country. So tonight, whether you are a Cuban novice, you've never been to the country before, or maybe you've already been to Havana and fell in love and want to find something else, we definitely are going to expose you to some of the incredible possibilities that you'll find when you leave Cuba, or excuse me, leave the boundaries of Havana and head out into Cuba's countryside. A lot of what you'll see tonight are actual personal photos from both April Springer, who I'll introduce in a moment, and myself from some of our journeys. So just in case you're not already familiar with the company, let's see here. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. In case you're not already familiar with the company, let me just fill you in a little bit about International Expeditions. We actually are a 37-year-old company who has really excelled in bringing people to the world's most compelling wild destinations via incredible riverboat journeys, land programs, both of which we offer in Cuba. Consequently, we actually were first able to take Americans to Cuba legally in 2003, and we've been using that expertise to create immersive, authentic, incredible programs. We found great leaders, great guides who really add just a ton of insight and depth into what you learn on the program. So right now I want to introduce you to April Springer. April is International Expeditions Cuba guru. She's been to the country more than a dozen times and is very, very well versed in the intricacies of the country. If April's name sounds familiar, you may recognize her from interviews she's done with NPR, the Miami Herald, Condé Nast, USA Today, Time, most recently Salon.com. So she is absolutely a subject matter expert and someone who loves sharing with you about the country. So of course, whenever you tell someone, gosh, I'm thinking about Cuba, they're going to automatically picture classic cars and the facades and Art Deco architecture of Havana. They may automatically think of the music and the Tropicana and the spectacle there. And in fact, even though International Expeditions is more known for our nature programs, our own staff, here is actually Kim, who arranges our Africa programs. She went to Cuba and fell in love with Havana as well. But there are so many things you should know about Cuba. So, April, I'm going to jump in and let you talk about some of your tips people should know about traveling to Cuba.
Well, thank you, Emily. That was a great introduction. So as Emily stated, I've been to Cuba more than a dozen times. I've escorted our group trips, and I've also traveled just to explore, to find new things, to check out restaurants, and have just learned a whole lot during my time in Cuba and then working with it on a day-to-day basis. Some of the most common questions I'm going to address with just a couple of quick tips if you're planning to travel to Cuba, whether it be with IE or on your own. So the first, the cash. American credit cards and debit cards do not work in Cuba. Even if you had a credit card, say from Canada, there are very, very limited point of sale systems, so it really doesn't do you a whole lot of good. Cuba's also not cheap. People think of it as a very cheap destination because the people who live there don't make a lot of money, but the truth is it's very expensive. Hotel rooms range from $300 to the new Kapinski hotel that's opening is their going rate's about $1,100 a night. So a lot to think about in Cuba. And leading right into my next tip, hotel confirmation numbers that you get offline from a website that looks like a hotel may not be real. People have found out that the Americans don't really know how to navigate the Cuban waters just yet, and they've come up with all kinds of fake web pages to take your credit card information and give you something that looks like a confirmation when in fact you don't have anything reserved for you, and you show up in Cuba thinking that you've prepaid for your hotel, and there's nothing there. So just be very wary, very cautious. Make attempts to call and confirm and reconfirm those hotel reservations. So why can you travel to Cuba? How can you travel? Is it quote unquote opened up? Not really. Despite what the media would have you believe, you still have to have a legal reason to travel to Cuba. You cannot book one of the beautiful resorts on the beaches of Veradero and lay on them like a Canadian tourist for 10 days. You do need a program, a schedule of people-to-people activities or journalistic activities, educational activities, whatever your category of legal travel is, you have to be sure that you can meet those requirements. Our next tip as it loads here, cell phones and internet. So in Cuba, there's one company that provides cell phone coverage and internet service, and some U.S. carriers have made agreements with that agency in Cuba, and you can use your cell phones. But you need to call your carrier and tell them that you're going to be in Cuba, that you want the service turned on. It's not just the same as international roaming or anything like that. The rates are incredibly high. So it's just something to think about before you pack your cell phone and think you're going to use it. Even my AT&T cell phone does not work unless I call AT&T and tell them to turn it on. And internet access. So internet is heavily regulated by the government. You only find internet in the hotels, most of the time only in the lobby, not necessarily in your room. And then they have these random hotspots. So you'll be driving along and you'll see this crowd of people staring at their phones all sitting around this one park bench, and it's because that particular park has a Wi-Fi hotspot. And even to get internet access, you have to have a card that you have to buy. It's not free. So there's just a lot of little details that go into making all of that stuff happen in Cuba.
And April, before we move to the next tip, several people have already chimed in asking how you would get one of those internet access cards.
So you can find those at different places. Some of the hotels sell them. For example, the Park Central Hotel will sell them, but only if you're a registered guest of the hotel. And then there are other places that you would never even think you could go in and buy an internet card, but that's exactly what they are, little shops. But the best thing to do is just to ask your guide or ask a local, explain what you need, and try to find them, because it's not as easy as walking into the corner drugstore and walking out with your internet access card. I see some questions popping up, and let's just pop back to money really quickly. So can you use U.S. dollars? What you would do is take those U.S. dollars and exchange them for Cuban convertible pesos, basically. In Cuba, there's two currencies. One is for locals and one is for tourists. When you exchange your U.S. dollar for the CUC, the currency for tourists, you lose a 13% tax right off the top. So they technically exchange 1-to-1, but you lose 13%. So if you exchange $100, you get 87 CUCs. Some places will take your U.S. dollars, but they just add the conversion fee onto your U.S. dollar. So if something was labeled for 10 CUCs, you're going to pay $11.30 or whatever they come up with. And as far as euros, Canadian dollars, things like that, so we've had reports back that Americans are taking down the euro, but when you exchange money, you have to show your passport to exchange it. And they say, oh, well, you're American, so I have to charge you a 13% tax on your euro. even though you technically should be able to exchange the euro at the going rate. So it just varies, and it really depends on who you get at the exchange window that day. So my last tip is to be flexible, be adventurous. Try to not ask why, but just accept things as they are. It will never make sense. You will always come back with more questions than you left with. I've been there 12 times, and I still just scratch my head and wonder why and how, but that's just their way, and we're not going to change their opinions. So the best thing you can do is to just be adventurous, be flexible, and go with it.
And although April is the expert, I wanted to just add my own little tip for travel to Cuba, and that is to have fun. I think that sometimes people hear the phrase people to people or legal travel or authorized travel, and they think that it's code for restrictive and boring and that you have to be in a classroom or attending a church service or something along those lines, which may have been true in the past. But under the people-to-people activities that international expeditions goes to Cuba under, it just means that you're talking to the locals. Now, whether that's a local chef or a local musician or a local naturalist.
So the next thing we were going to talk about is just kind of what you can do during your time in Havana. So of course the four squares that really tell the story of Cuba and how it was founded and started, and tell the story of Havana. You can also visit the fortress, the castle, learn about Shea's part that he played in the history of Cuba. You, of course, can't go to Cuba without visiting the Hemingway haunts, so you can track him, his favorite bars, his favorite hotel. At Hotel Ambos Mundos, there's still a room that Hemingway kept rented all the time, so that if he ever got tired of his wife, he could run to the hotel and write. So there's all of the Hemingway things you can do. You can visit his home, which is preserved just the way it was the day that he left. His boat is there. Even the pool, it's drained, but it's there. And his cat graves, which are always an interesting story.
Just going to add, especially if you're a bit of a literary nerd like I am, Hemingway wrote some of his most famous pieces, Old Man in the Sea, A Movable Feast, For Whom the Bell Tolls, while living in these same places. You can see, it is only a replica now, but you can see replica pieces that were made for Hemingway by Picasso. You can also, as you peek through the windows, if you visited Hemingway's home in Key West, he got to be obsessed with his weight. So you can actually see where he kept track of it by writing on the wall. So these are all really fascinating insights into his life, just a nice glimpse as you're going through Havana.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's so much Hemingway history, and the Cubans are really proud of Hemingway's love for their country. Of course, you can't go to Cuba without tripping over an artist, a dancer, a musician. The culture is so rich, and a lot of Cubans will tell you that all goes back to Fidel, and that his belief that every Cuban should have access to education, but to also really pursue their passion. And that is why there are so many dancers, musicians, singers, painters, sketch artists, handicraft makers, wood carvers. I mean, just the list goes on and on. You cannot come back from Cuba without a ton of artwork. And you can buy it almost anywhere. People will set up shops in their doorways. And then there's a huge market in Havana near the bay that you can also go and visit. There's a rum museum, a cigar factory, all of these things that just scream Cuba. And so those are all kinds of things that you can really take advantage of in Havana. The classic cars, not pictured here, the Coco taxis, which are like a go-kart on steroids. Very fun experience just to ride down the Malecon in the little Cocoa taxis. But then, IE really focuses on getting outside of Havana. So I know most of you probably know that the cruise ships are coming. They've been awarded the permissions to come into port in Havana. So we're really focusing on getting outside of Havana and seeing what else Cuba is all about.
Absolutely. And as April said, the way to really discover Cuba's true nature is to get out of Havana into the countryside and to really see what daily life is like. Of course, everyone, like we said, thinks about the classic cars and facades of Havana, but when you get out into the countryside, you'll really see how rich and diverse the country is. So as you leave Havana with international expeditions, you're going to find an incredible variety of UNESCO sites and World Biosphere Reserves, gorgeous small towns that we'll be exploring in just a moment, as well as more than 24 endemic bird species, including the world's smallest bird. Plus, getting out into the Caribbean's largest botanic garden and really learning how some of these orchid species played into the history of Cuba, as well as seeing sugar, coffee, and tobacco plantations. So let's just dive into a little bit more of what you'll see. You may think about the beaches of Cuba, especially if you have Canadian friends who have been. But what you may not realize is that there are incredible protected areas where pristine wetlands go right to vibrant Caribbean waters. And it's just a gorgeous country. When you get outside of Havana, you can get into the mountains and go hiking. You can, like we said, spot some of this incredible endemic bird life. Which of course includes, like I said, the world's smallest bird, which is the bee hummingbird. And this photo was actually taken just 2 weeks ago by our expedition leader, Angel. Additionally, some of the other bird life includes Cuban emeralds, Fernandina's flicker, the Cuban toady, which is that cute little sherbet-looking bird, parrots, and the bird in the top right, the Cuban trogon, is actually what the Cuban flag was modeled after. Of course, one of April's favorites is the pygmy owl, which she loves seeing when we go out birding with Orlando, who's one of the contacts that we've made over the year. And of course, you'll see migratory species as well. But of course, getting out into the countryside isn't just about birding. You see incredible topography of Cuba. In the Vinales Valley in the countryside, they actually have mogotes, which are formed by the same karst topography that formed Halong Bay. So it's much like the bay, except instead of water, you have tobacco plantations in between these rock formations, as well as, like I said, some just really incredibly gorgeous orchards. You may have an opportunity to try horseback riding when you're visiting plantations. And like I said, you're really getting insight into the daily life as you visit families. The family on this slide is actually the Colorado family. They own a coffee plantation, and the last time I traveled to their home, I was with a father and son who actually own a business working with sustainably harvest coffee. And we spent about 2 hours just chatting with the family, getting to really know them, and they were just so warm and welcoming. And of course, the photography, the characters you meet, and the people are so warm and they don't mind having their pictures taken, which is always nice to come home with a great memory. As you're out in the countryside, of course, we stop at tobacco plantations, rolling factories, so you get to see how cigars are hand-rolled the same way they have been for hundreds of years. So when you're in Havana later and you buy maybe a Cohiba to take home with you, you have a little bit greater respect and knowledge for everything that went into that cigar. One of the other things that I really enjoyed about getting outside of Havana was just some of the things that, you see in the countryside. At the Che Guevara Memorial, you actually see the mausoleum dedicated to this, historic figure who still looms so large in the lives of Cubans. You also see here in the top right, this is actually a pre-revolutionary construction project that was something Bautista started, and then it was just abandoned. And then additionally, I like to include this chalkboard, because one of the things that we get to do is to go into a ration store. I'm sure as many of you know, Cubans get most of their staples, eggs, rice, things of that nature, via their ration books. But what you may not know is that just because you get 2 dozen eggs monthly as part of your rations, that doesn't actually mean that if you go tomorrow there will be 2 dozen eggs. So, we ask the question, why do we keep seeing so many Cuban people with shopping bags? And our guide told us, well, some people have a head and arms and legs in their body. Cubans have a head and arms and legs, a body and their back, because you have to stop by the ration the ration shop 2 or 3 times a day, every single day, to find throughout the month your ration, because you never know when the rice will be there, when the eggs will be there, and you don't get to carry that over month to month. So not that there aren't ration stores in Havana, obviously, but when you get into these smaller towns, they're easier to find, and the people are, of course, very willing to share that information and show you how they live day to day. And of course, when you get out into the countryside, you get to go to Playa Girón, or the Bay of Pigs. And of course, we know the Bay of Pigs for the invasion and the great history, but it's also just a gorgeous place. While we're there, whether on our Complete Cuba program or our Cuba Voyage, you do also get to go to the museum to learn about the history of the invasion from the Cuban side, which is just a really interesting perspective to get. So I'm going to turn over now to April just to talk through some of the specifics of things that we do on our program. April?
Thank you, Emily. So International Expeditions started out in Cuba offering only 2 land programs. And of those, one of them really stuck out as a really great offering, and that was our Complete Cuba program. Complete Cuba is 10 days, 9 nights. It starts in Miami, so we include an overnight in Miami, a meet and greet in Miami where you'll meet your expedition leader, and then you fly to Cuba on commercial service. Now that commercial service is established, you begin in Cienfuegos and then make your way to Havana. But on our Complete Cuba program, you visit 7 different cities and actually stop and visit, not just see or drive through, several UNESCO World Heritage Sites, such as the Vinales Valley and Havana Vieja, or Old Havana. Complete Cuba offers nature, culture, history. This tour really has it all. So if you're wanting to go to Cuba and really kind of get an overview of the island, this is a great tour for you. And you do it with a small group, so the experiences are more personalized, more individual. You're fully escorted by an expedition leader, a Cuban national guide who's there to teach you all about Cuba. Your touring is done on a motor coach like you would see here in the States. They're Chinese made. They range in size to fit the group. And they have air conditioning, they're comfortable, they're clean, they're reliable. It's a really great option for a country where, most people don't have access to great vehicles. Then to talk a little bit about the itinerary, so in Cienfuegos, you will get to enjoy a performance by the Cienfuegos Choir, walk the streets with locals, maybe share a cigar, and then you move into Trinidad, Tocas de Toyantes, the mountain range above Trinidad. You visit the sugarcane plantation, move into the Bay of Pigs, see Playa Huron, the museum there. Dance with locals at your lunch spot. There's music everywhere. You're truly immersed in the culture of the country. And then from there you move into Soroa, the orchid gardens, Vinales. This is a beautiful organic farm in Vinales where you have, from farm to table dining, very unique experience. And then lastly, Havana, where you kind of wrap up the tour and see a little bit more of the city. The artist, the capital, which doesn't look like that right now because they're renovating it and have been for several years. It's going to be gorgeous when they're done. And then we also offer our Cuba Voyage program. So if the quirky hotels are not for you, here's a couple of our hotels that we use on Complete Cuba. At the bottom, you'll notice the cute little bungalows at Playa Larga where you have your own little private bungalow. And then we have the beautiful lobby of Hotel La Union in Cienfuegos, and then the big picture here is the Parque Central Hotel, located right in Old Havana. Beautiful views from the windows, easily accessible to the city if you want to get out at night and walk around, or maybe hit up one of Hemingway's favorite bars. So our Cuba Voyage is aboard the Panorama. She's a 48-passenger motor sailor. Due to the larger number of travelers, you're actually escorted by 2 expedition leaders, a local guide, a Cuban national guide, who stays on board with you. So they do this trip from start to finish, including being on board, and you can kind of grab them at a meal and sit with them and ask them any questions that you have. It's really a great one-on-one experience. I've had the pleasure to do this trip twice, actually. And it's a very comfortable way to spend the week on board the Panorama. You're always going to have air conditioning, you're always going to have a hot shower, some things that the quirky hotels may not always provide. So the itinerary on the Cuba Voyage is a little bit different, but it offers you some things that you wouldn't get otherwise. So you have Cienfuegos, Trinidad, the Bay of Pigs, but you also get the Isle of Youth, or the island of Juventud, as they say in Spanish. I'm sure I just butchered it, but that's my best try. So this island you couldn't get to unless you used a ferry or a helicopter. That's quite scary. I had the pleasure of doing that in 2015. But this island is amazing. Fidel was actually imprisoned on this island, and the prison is now a museum, and you can visit it and really see what he went through to change the country, whether you believe in what he did or not. But there's also an opportunity to really get in some water activities here. And then you continue on to Maria La Gorda, where you have a chance to visit one of the largest national parks in Cuba. You still get Vinales Valley, and then you end in Havana, and you actually have an extended amount of time in Havana. So if the heavily nature-focused itinerary isn't for you, then the Cuba Voyage may be more your style. The beautiful observation deck, you can see here the cabins at the bottom. So on board the Panorama, there are 3 levels of, or 3 decks with cabins, and there are 4 different cabin levels. Some are double-bedded, as you can see, and then some are twin. And every cabin has private bath, shower, air conditioning, etc. And one of my favorite things about the panorama was the cuisine. I love Cuban food, but the rice and beans gets a little old. By day 4 or 5, you're ready for something new. And so when you're on board the panorama, you get to have this wonderful international cuisine served to you, on a plate while you sit and rock back and forth. It's just a really wonderful experience. You have breakfast every day on board, dinner some nights on board, and then you get to experience the Cuban, the paladars in the evenings, or at lunches, and then some of your dinners. So you don't miss out on the Cuban experience, but you just get to break it up a little bit.
And April, I'm going to jump in because a couple of people have heard the word paladar used a few times now and have asked, what's a paladar?
So a paladar. So up until 2013, the Cuban government owned all restaurants. They were all state-owned, run, managed, etc. And in 2013, the Cuban government said, okay, you can have a restaurant because some of the Cubans are some of the best chefs you'd ever meet, but you can only have 3 tables with 4 chairs per table. And as this became a huge popular thing in Cuba, the government finally gave in and said, okay, fine, you can have more tables. And there was the paladar. So paladar simply means that it's a privately owned, run, managed, funded restaurant. And you see in the paladars, you can really see your dollar going to the people. Some of the paladar owners have been so successful that they have had to move out of their home because their entire home is now their restaurant, and they're so proud of it. One of my favorites is a paladar in the Bay of Pigs, and the young man that owns it used to be a bellman at the hotel, and he saved all his tips from being a bellman at the hotel, and they opened their restaurant. And now their restaurant is so big that they've had to move out of their home. And it's just a really cool experience. So some of the highlights from the Cuba Voyage, in Trinidad, you visit a local potter, get to watch him at his wheel, if you will. There's also an opportunity to purchase some items. This is a picture of one of the paladars. You can see the dishes don't necessarily match and the cups are all different ones, but that's just proof that the Cubans do what they can with what they have, and it's a really wonderful experience. The Cuba Voyage also gives you an opportunity to really experience the water. So a couple of these shots are from Maria La Gorda, where you disembark and you get to spend some time there. You can do snorkeling from the beach, very easy. And then also from the Isle of Youth, you're able to take advantage of some of the water activities as well. And then also in Maria La Gorda, one of my favorite things, you can go and visit a local school. Most of the schools do not allow tourists, so it's kind of a big deal to get to go into the school and really see, meet the children, talk to them, sing with them. Very cool experiences. And then in Havana, so this would be the end of the trip, you experience all the great things about Havana, which we've covered, the dance. Some of the best paladars are truly in Havana. The arts and crafts market, just a really, the local car garage, where you see how these magicians keep these cars running. You see this 50 Chevrolet and you pop the hood and there's like a Kia motor in there because that's what they have. But the Cuban engineering does not let you down. Beautiful dancers of all ages. We visit a dance school that actually teaches young girls from the community how to dance, and they pay nothing. They just, if their parents can get them there, they can take lessons, and it's just a neat experience. And then our last option for Cuba, so just recently, President Obama, prior to or former President Obama, excuse me, prior to leaving office, made a few changes that to the Cuban policy that allowed us to offer you private travel options. So if you're not necessarily interested in a 10-day long tour, or if you really just want to go down and see Havana but you can't figure it out, we are happy to help you set up a private tour. We tailor it to your interest. You know, you have a private guide, a private vehicle. We can assist with your airfare if you'd like. We have access to almost all of the hotels. Some we do not have access to because of the government regulations. And we can help you as a party of one up to a party of 80. I escorted a group of 80 down to Cuba last year in May, and we had a great time. And these are some of the private accommodations. So if you are interested in doing a private tour but you're not necessarily interested in the hotel options, I do have access to several villas in Havana, as well as just private apartments or private hotels in the cities outside of Havana. And again, I love to use the private accommodations. I feel like you can really see your dollar at work. So just to talk a little bit about the food, one of the questions that we got was, you know, is the food safe? Is the water safe? Can they handle my special dietary requirements, things like that. So do not drink the water. You would always want to use your bottled water. If you went on any of our tours, you'll be given water. But if you're trying to go on your own, avoid the water from the tap. Even for brushing your teeth, you should probably use bottled water. The private restaurants, ice is safe because it's generally filtered. But if you're in a state-run restaurant or even in your hotel, some of the hotels outside of Havana, you probably want to just avoid ice. As far as food, I always tell people my suggestion is to, you know, don't jump right into the raw vegetables, the raw fruits. You know, stick with the cooked stuff for the first few days and then kind of ease yourself into it. This is a totally different cuisine, quite likely, than what you're used to. But there are wonderful options.
And I'll just jump in here too as well, April, to talk a little bit about the government-run restaurants versus the paladars. And on all of our travel options, you really will have both options so that you can compare the kinds of food, the kinds of service that you get. But quite frankly, there are some fantastic government-run restaurants as well. Don't think that if you go to a government restaurant, that automatically means it's horrible. I will say too, in the 4 or 5 years since I first traveled to Cuba, I think the food has gotten much better and much more diverse. The options are incredible as well. I've eaten at very small homes where we were outdoor and we had a very simple but great meal of Cuban specialties like ropa vieja, which I know is April's favorite. I have eaten at paladars where there were European trained chefs who came back to Cuba because they could finally own their own business and served us lobster and European, French style cuisine. And there's just such a great variety. Is there anything else you want to talk about on food before we leave? I love, like I said, I love the food. I think there are some people, but I will.
You have me really craving ropa vieja right now. Thanks, Emily.
Absolutely, you're welcome. I will say too, though, and I'm sure if you've been considering travel to Cuba, you know this. Cuban food in Miami is not Cuban food in Cuba. So just keep that in mind. And again, going back to April's tips, embrace that flexibility and sense of adventure. Now to the question that is flooding the inbox, and I know is a particular favorite of yours, April, paperwork, visas. If you would just run back through your money tips again, because people are still a little bit confused about euros still getting the penalty again. So if you'll address that again as well.
Absolutely. So to enter Cuba as a U.S. citizen, you do have to have a Cuban tourist visa. You can see it in the right-hand corner. It's changed just a little bit. The color's a little bit different now, but you will have to have that upon arrival. You actually cannot board the plane without one. So if you traveled with International Expeditions, we provide that visa for you on any way you travel, whether it be Complete Cuba, Cuba Voyage, or a private Cuba trip. If you're doing this on your own, because I've seen a lot of questions, you can buy these from the airline. You just need to contact the airline, and there'll be some paperwork that you have to fill out, and they can assist you with obtaining your visa. Back to the money. So money in Cuba is just extremely confusing. You'll see here all of the CUCs. So CUCs come 1, 3, 5, 10, 20, 50, 100, just like our money with the addition of the $3 bill. These are what is equal to a U.S. dollar. However, when you exchange your U.S. dollars for these CUCs, you are charged a 13% tax on that U.S. dollar. This is kind of Cuba's way of getting back at us for the embargo that's been in place for quite some time. So if you wanted to try to take euro, the euro it actually has an exchange rate to the CUC that fluctuates just as the market fluctuates. However, when you go to exchange those euros, they may look at your passport and say, oh, you're American, you have to pay a 13% tax on this euro. So it really depends. I've had reports of both of those things, people avoiding the tax and people being taxed. Here, within the last couple of months, I actually have a partner who's down there right now, and he tried it, and at the airport he was charged it, but then in a hotel lobby he wasn't. So you just don't know what's going to happen with the euro. You're kind of taking a risk. I can only tell you, exactly what you're going to get when talking about the U.S. dollar. And I see another question popping up about debit cards, credit cards, being from a Canadian bank or maybe from a European bank. You can take them, and there may be hotels that have the point of sale system, the technology that actually runs the magnetic strip and it processes. But in most cases, in the restaurants, etc., you're not going to find those point of sale systems, so those credit cards really aren't going to do you a whole lot of good. You really should just travel with cash. And what we recommend is, a couple of $100s per person, even on these prepaid tours, because you just don't know what will happen, and you don't know what you may find. Someone asked earlier about artwork, and artwork can cost you one CUC or hundreds of CUCs. It just depends on the artist. There are some artists in Cuba that are famous, that have artwork in New Zealand and New York and all over the world. So there's an opportunity to purchase right from their studio in Cuba, but only if you have your money. The tourists, no matter if you're American or any other foreigner, you don't use the Cuban local currency. In fact, I was down just doing some exploring, and I was with a Cuban friend, and he's like, we're going to take this bus, and I'm going to pay our way in my local currency. And the bus driver looked at him like he was crazy, because I didn't get to pay the Cuban rate. I had to pay the tourist rate. So you want to avoid those. And you'll find that in Cuba, people will try to sell you the Cuban peso, and they're really worthless. I mean, they're like, one Cuban peso is worth like 0.0024 cents or something. It's just almost worthless. But they'll try to sell them to you as like souvenirs. So watch out for that. Be aware the difference between the two currencies. It's very obvious. You'll see that on the CUC, it will always say convertibles, and that lets you know that that's a CUC.
One other question about paperwork, April. A lot of, obviously, if you are traveling with a company like International Expeditions, you'll be on an authorized trip. But of course, some people are trying to travel on their own now. So sort of two questions. how do you certify and keep up with paperwork that shows that you went to Cuba for an authorized reason? And are you finding that there's any time when people need to produce that paperwork, say once they come back from their trip?
Absolutely. So in 2015, there were actually people that were penalized several $1,000s for traveling to Cuba unauthorized. If you're trying to travel to Cuba on your own and you're not traveling through an organization that sponsors your travel, so when you travel through International Expeditions is sponsoring your travel. We are then liable to the government. You know, we know what we can and cannot do. We know what's permissible and not permissible. But if you're going to do it on your own, I suggest that you go to the OFAC website and read about the legal reasons of travel. Keep notes, keep a diary, keep anything and everything you can possibly think of, because if you have global entry, as many of our travelers do that travel the world all the time, you got to re-up for that global entry, and they're going to want to know where your paperwork is for that Cuban stamp that's in your passport. And if you can't produce it, you may not get your global entry, and you may also be audited for your travel. So you really want to make sure that your paperwork's in order, that you're doing everything the right way. Someone asked a question about, you know, what do I think about the administration, the current U.S. administration, and their views on Cuba? And I'll tell you, I really don't know. I've thought about it, and I've laid awake in bed at night staring at the ceiling trying to figure it out, but I honestly don't know. It could really go any way. And so we have set ourselves up in such a way that we are prepared that if things are rolled back and you have to go back to the days of having a paper license like you see on the screen here, issued from the Department of the Treasury. We had one when it was necessary. We had one for several years, and we have the application ready and waiting should we need it again so that we can continue to offer these tours. And then if things open up, we have our relationships in place that we will take advantage of that and really be able to expand the tours, offer different options.
Perfect. So we've been addressing a lot of questions as we go, but I just want to take this opportunity to thank everyone again for joining us and just let you know that we do still have some 2017 space available on our Complete Cuba program, or to arrange private options. And of course, we already are looking forward to 2018 with our voyage aboard the Panorama. Again, there's been some questions about if there are any kind of recommended or required vaccinations to travel to Cuba. April?
So there's nothing that is required. There are some things that are recommended dependent upon where you're going to be traveling in the country. I see a question that just popped up about malaria, Zika. Zika it does exist in Cuba. It's been confirmed, just like it was confirmed in Florida. So you know, you should take precautions, take your insect repellent, wear long sleeves if you're going to be out in the countryside. I personally have not had bad experiences with mosquitoes in Havana, but outside of Havana, you're in the Zapata swamp at Bay of Pigs. There's going to be mosquitoes in the swamp, so you should definitely prepare yourself. Malaria is not of an issue in Cuba. And I'm just going to jump into some of these other questions, Emily, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, so snorkeling and scuba diving. So snorkeling is an option on the Complete Cuba as well as the Cuba Voyage program, but it's not something that we put a lot of emphasis on because that's not really people to people, more people to fish. But there are a few opportunities. Scuba diving. The Cuban medical insurance that you have to go to Cuba will not cover scuba diving. So for right now, that's not something that we can offer. but maybe in the future, as things continue to change between our two countries, that will be something that's a possibility. Cuba has done an amazing job of protecting their reefs, so it's something that we're ready and waiting when that's available.
And as a side note to that, because you did mention the required Cuban medical insurance, when you travel with international expeditions, we actually do include that with your package.
Yes, and any airline ticket that you purchase from any provider, whether that be Southwest or American or Delta or whoever, they are actually required to include that medical insurance in your flight ticket. So if you're going to go through Panama or you're flying Copa or Aeromexico, it's not going to be included, and it's quite difficult to purchase. So, go the right way, go through the U.S., have your medical insurance, because Lord forbid you need it and don't have it. So I have somebody asking about August trips. We do not have a complete Cuba or a Cuba Voyage. The waters are too bad in August to try to sail. But if you wanted to do something custom, I would be happy to help put something together. We can absolutely do an August trip. Are American tourists allowed to be alone? Absolutely. So you do have to have, according to the OFAC regulations, you have to have a full-time schedule of people-to-people activities. But in the afternoons or, after you've done your touring, you can absolutely go out and walk around, enjoy the towns. I love to go walking around all over Cuba. It's very, very safe. I have 2 small children that I'm trying to get down there this summer. I feel very safe taking my kids. It's not a place where you have to be worried about anything more than, pickpocketers. You should definitely always keep your money and your passport safe, as with travel to any international destination. I mean, I would here in Birmingham, Alabama, I would keep my money safe. But just general safety practices should keep you safe. Tipping,
and the people are extremely warm and welcoming as well. They are always, I've never been there when someone didn't want to chat, they didn't want to talk, they didn't want to ask me what I thought about Cuba. So I think in addition to it just being a generally safe place, you'll also really enjoy your time out, whether it's going to a dance party in the mountains above Topaz de Quiantes or a jazz club in Cienfuegos. It really is a great layer of fun to add on to your time.
Absolutely. So another question that popped up, Cuba for vegetarians or vegans. We take vegetarians down all the time, vegans as well. You'll be offered a lot of eggs and pasta and the same vegetable on repeat, it will feel like. But there are options, especially when you're out in the countryside. Like if you go to the organic farm where they have several options, my vegetarians always love that stop. There's also a vegetarian restaurant that specializes in vegetarian dishes in Las Terrazas, which we visit on our Complete Cuba program. And I can do something, that includes Las Terrazas on a custom basis. So no worries there about vegetarian options. They're absolutely possible. Tipping. So you're going to find in Cuba that everybody expects a tip for everything they do, and that's just kind of their way to survive. And again, you just kind of go with it. If you're traveling on our Complete Cuba program or our Cuba Voyage, we include tips to the hotel porters, to restaurant wait staff, to local specialists, so that you're not having to constantly put your hand in your pocket. We try to make it as inclusive as possible, and then the only tips that are required are the tips to your Cuban guide, your driver, and then your expedition leader. And if you do a customized program, it's the same way. I try to include, all the tips for any service that's included, and then you just tip your guide at the end of the tour.
And April, you touched on not having to put your hand in your pocket a good bit. So maybe address some of the inclusions that you'll find on our small group programs. I know as someone who has traveled on other kinds of programs, I was really surprised at the amount of food and drink and snacking, and of course every excursion is included.
Absolutely. So you look at our Cuba Voyage and compare it to some of the other larger cruise ships that are coming into Cuba. Every excursion is included. You're not going to be, stuck paying more and more and more individual prices for these tours. What you see is truly what you get. I had a question earlier that talked about capability, and so just really quick while we're talking about the Cuba Voyage. The Cuba Voyage is, I would say, is not for someone that's handicapped. If you're not steady on your feet, it will be a challenging program for you to enjoy. But if you just maybe require, a walker, like a walking stick or a cane, you could absolutely take part in our Complete Cuba program. And if you can't go on the hike in Tope Seco Yances, no big deal. Have a seat at the coffee house and just wait for everyone to return. The weather in the mountains is beautiful. And it's not, there's nothing that's going to be just overly strenuous. It's an easygoing trip, and you could get a lot out of that tour. And then I just had a gentleman, actually he's coming back today, who is wheelchair bound, and we put together a customized program for him. So if Cuba's on your list, but you're afraid that you can't do it or it doesn't have the ADA compliance things like we have here, give me a call. We can make something happen. So talking about inclusions, back to inclusions, on Complete Cuba and the Cuba Voyage, you are going to have all of your meals, your activities, drinks with your meals. I was just down there last month, and we sat down to this restaurant, and they said, okay, you have 4 drinks included. And I went, my God, how can someone drink 4 drinks at lunch? But we did. So we really try to include as much as possible throughout the day. You have bottled water stocked on the bus at all times. Any kind of stop that you may make, you've got a drink included, or the expedition leader may grab some snacks and pass them out on the bus. So we really try to make sure that you're taken care of.
Absolutely. And we've passed now the top of the hour, so I want to once more thank everyone for joining us. If you have any additional questions, you probably have about 1 more minute to pop them in the box. And of course, as always, please feel free to give us a call at 800-633-4734 or ietravel.com. And either April or myself, again, my name is Emily, we'd be happy to help you out and try and answer any questions for you. April, is there any closing remarks you'd like?
I don't think so. I think I've addressed all the questions. So if you had one and I didn't get to it, please pop it up there. A dairy allergy. So you don't really find a lot of dairy products because there's not a lot of dairy cows in Cuba, so you should be just fine. Where here, everything is served with cheese and milk. There, you're not going to find that. Everything is served with rum and beer. So you shouldn't have a problem. Just to make sure that when you sit down to a meal, or if you're traveling on one of our trips, you let us know those things, and we'll make sure the restaurant is aware.
Thank you, April, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
And with that, we will conclude our webinar. Goodbye, everyone.